For most of the last two seasons, Formula One treated Red Bull like an untouchable empire. Max Verstappen kept winning. The RB19 looked historically dominant, and every difficult weekend was dismissed as temporary noise. But inside the paddock, people started noticing something else. The tension was no longer coming from rival teams trying to catch Red Bull. It was starting to come from inside Red Bull itself, because while Verstappen was still collecting victories, the structure around him was becoming increasingly unstable. Christian Horner was dealing with internal controversy. Adrian Newey suddenly became the center of exit rumors. Jos Verstappen publicly criticized leadership decisions, and at the exact same time, the FIA began tightening scrutiny around aggressive racing standards. Individually, those stories looked manageable. Together, they started forming a pattern that Red Bull may have ignored for too long. And now, Verstappen looks trapped between a team he no longer fully trusts and a Formula One landscape that is already preparing for the next power shift. That matters more than people realize, because dominant teams usually collapse long before the championship table reflects it. The public version of the story says Red Bull is still on top. Verstappen is still winning races, the numbers still look elite, but the timing of everything happening around him tells a much more dangerous story, especially once you go back to where the cracks first started becoming visible. At the beginning of Red Bull dominance, almost nothing looked vulnerable. Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Japan, race after race, Verstappen controlled weekends before Sunday even started. In several qualifying sessions, Red Bull had enough pace margin to manage tires while rivals pushed flat out just to stay close. Inside Formula One, engineers were openly describing the RB19 as one of the most complete aerodynamic packages of the modern era. But dominance has a strange effect in Formula One. It hides instability. And by early 2024, several unrelated stories suddenly started colliding at the same time. The first major shock came with the Christian Horner investigation. Publicly, Red Bull tried to project stability. Internally, the situation immediately created visible tension between different power groups inside the organization. Then came Jos Verstappen. His comments were unusually direct. He warned that the team risked being torn apart if leadership issues continued escalating. That detail mattered more than people realized because Jos rarely speaks publicly unless the Verstappen camp wants pressure applied somewhere. And suddenly, Red Bull no longer looked politically unified. At the same time, another name kept quietly appearing in paddock conversations: Adrian Newey. At first, Ferrari links sounded speculative. Then Aston Martin discussions emerged. Then reports suggested Newey himself was reconsidering long-term involvement. That changed the atmosphere completely. Because inside Formula One, Newey is not viewed like a normal technical director. He is viewed as the structural advantage behind multiple championship eras. Losing him would not just weaken Red Bull technically, it would weaken confidence across the entire project. Especially for Verstappen, then the racing environment itself started changing. McLaren became dramatically faster after Miami, Mercedes slowly recovered consistency. Ferrari improved tire management across multiple race weekends, and suddenly Verstappen was no longer winning races by 20 seconds without pressure. Now the margins mattered. In Imola, qualifying gaps tightened. In Hungary, strategy execution became critical. In Austria, Verstappen sounded increasingly frustrated on team radio as tire degradation and race management became more complicated. Those messages sounded small in isolation, but the tone kept changing, less relaxed, more irritated, more demanding. And around the same period, FIA scrutiny around racing conduct also intensified. Stewarding decisions across several weekends created growing debate about consistency. Drivers privately questioned where the line actually existed for aggressive wheel-to-wheel defense. Verstappen became central to these conversations, whether Red Bull liked it or not. The timing becomes important here. Because while Red Bull was dealing with internal politics, the competitive field was compressing around them at exactly the wrong moment. That combination creates pressure. Formula One teams hate most political instability during performance vulnerability, and suddenly rumors about Verstappen future clauses and long-term options no longer sounded unrealistic, especially once Mercedes started getting linked again behind the scenes. Because if Verstappen believes Red Bull might lose its technical edge after the 2026 regulation reset, then every current decision starts looking different. Not emotional, strategic. And that possibility completely changes how the last several months should be interpreted. Wait until you see what happens when all these events stop looking isolated and start forming a connected pattern. Once the timeline is connected properly, the Verstappen situation stops looking like normal championship frustration. It starts looking like a warning signal, because three separate developments were all escalating at the same time: FIA pressure, internal Red Bull instability, and shrinking competitive advantage. That combination almost never ends cleanly in Formula One. Start with the FIA side first. Over the last several seasons, Verstappen built his dominance partly around extreme confidence in wheel to wheel aggression. Late braking, minimal racing room, high pressure defensive positioning, it forced rivals into mistakes constantly. But several drivers began quietly pushing back on how those battles were being judged. And by the middle of the season, stewarding discussions started becoming more sensitive around consistency. Miami mattered here, Imola mattered too, because drivers were suddenly interpreting racing standards differently weekend to weekend. Some believed the FIA wanted tighter control over aggressive defense. Others believed enforcement remained inconsistent, that uncertainty changes driver behavior immediately, especially for someone like Verstappen, whose advantage often comes from operating at the absolute edge of racecraft tolerance. Inside the paddock, people noticed something subtle. Verstappen was no longer driving from pure control. Increasingly, he was driving from resistance. That distinction matters because once a dominant driver feels the system itself becoming unpredictable, frustration spreads beyond the car, and Red Bull responded poorly to the timing of that shift. While the FIA discussions intensified publicly, internal political fractures inside Red Bull became harder to hide. The Horner controversy did not disappear after the headlines faded. It simply moved deeper into the organization, Austrian leadership interests, British operational leadership, Verstappen camp influence, technical staff uncertainty. Multiple power centers suddenly started pulling in different directions. Then Adrian Newey became the symbol of the entire situation. Because Newey leaving would not only remove technical expertise, it would remove long-term confidence. Formula One drivers do not just evaluate current pace, they evaluate future trajectories, especially elite drivers with leverage. And Verstappen has more leverage than anyone on the grid. That is why the timing of Newey rumors became so dangerous. At the exact moment McLaren began closing the performance gap, Red Bull started looking uncertain about its own long-term structure. The public standing still showed Verstappen leading races, but internally, the feeling around Red Bull had changed completely. And there was another signal people overlooked: the radio messages. Not the angry moments everybody clipped for social media, the wording itself. Earlier in Red Bull dominance, Verstappen sounded collaborative during difficult moments. Sharp sometimes, but controlled, focused on execution. More recently, the tone changed toward distrust. Questions about strategy, timing, tire decisions, car balance direction, setup confidence. Even traffic management frustration became more visible. That evolution usually happens when drivers stop assuming the system around them is automatically reliable. And then the performance pressure increased again. McLaren suddenly forced Verstappen into qualifying laps with almost zero margin for error. Mercedes improved high-speed balance. Ferrari became harder to pass during race stints because tire degradation gaps narrowed significantly. 3/10 suddenly mattered again. That is psychologically exhausting for a driver who spent almost 2 seasons managing races from the front without sustained pressure. Inside the paddock, some engineers started comparing the atmosphere to earlier Formula One dynasty transitions. Not because Red Bull had collapsed already, because the emotional behavior inside dominant teams often changes before results collapse publicly. The analogy is almost mechanical. A suspension component does not fail instantly. Stress builds invisibly over time, tiny fractures form internally. Everything still appears stable until one final load exposes the weakness all at once. That may be exactly what is happening here, because the Verstappen story is probably not about anger. It is about confidence: confidence in leadership, confidence in technical direction, confidence in Red Bull ability to remain the safest long-term project after the 2026 regulation reset. And once you reinterpret the last year through that lens, almost every major event suddenly gains a different meaning. The Horner controversy stops being isolated politics. The Newey rumors stop being normal paddock gossip. The FEA tension stops feeling temporary. Even the Mercedes links stop sounding unrealistic. They start looking connected. And there's one uncomfortable implication sitting underneath all of it. If Verstappen genuinely believes Red Bull may lose structural stability after 2026, then he is no longer defending an empire. He may already be evaluating an exit strategy before the collapse becomes visible to everyone else. Because Formula One history shows the same pattern repeatedly. Drivers rarely leave after dynasties collapse, the smartest ones leave slightly before. And if that is what Verstappen is calculating right now, then the next phase of this story could reshape the entire Formula One grid faster than most people expect. The strongest evidence that something deeper is happening inside Red Bull is not a single interview or one difficult race weekend. It is the way multiple contradictions started appearing at the same time. Publicly, Red Bull continued projecting stability. Verstappen remained under long-term contract. The team still won races, the championship standing still favored them heavily, but underneath that surface, the behavior pattern stopped matching the messaging. Take the competitive trend first. Early during Red Bull dominance, Verstappen often managed race pace several tenths below the car's true capability. Tire conservation became strategic luxury rather than survival necessity. Rivals were fighting each other while Red Bull controlled race tempo from the front. That changed significantly once McLaren development gains arrived. Suddenly, Verstappen needed qualifying laps pushed much closer to the limit just to secure track position. In races where tire degradation narrowed between teams, Red Bull no longer controlled strategy windows comfortably. That is a major structural difference. Dominant teams prefer predictable races. Red Bull started getting unpredictable ones, and Verstappen behavior adapted immediately. You could hear it during radio communication, shorter patience, faster irritation, more direct criticism toward execution details, not emotional collapse, operational frustration. That distinction matters because elite drivers usually reveal confidence levels indirectly, especially drivers as controlled as Verstappen, then compare the timeline of political instability. Christian Horner controversy, Jos Verstappen criticism, Newey uncertainty, Mercedes links, regulation anxiety around 2026, FIA pressure discussions. None of those stories fully disappeared. They kept overlapping. That overlap is the real evidence. Because healthy Formula One dynasties normally absorb individual controversies without visible instability. Ferrari during the Schumacher era did it. Mercedes during the Hamilton dominance period did it repeatedly. Red Bull suddenly stopped looking capable of absorbing pressure cleanly. And there's another detail loyal Formula One viewers probably noticed before casual fans did. Verstappen stopped sounding emotionally attached to the project itself. Earlier in Red Bull dominance, even difficult interviews carried confidence about the future direction of the team. Recently, his language has become far more conditional, more performance focused, less ideological. That subtle shift matters enormously in Formula One politics. Because once a driver starts separating personal performance from organizational trust, future options start becoming easier psychologically. Inside the paddock, the Mercedes possibility keeps surviving for exactly that reason. Not because a deal is guaranteed, because people believe Verstappen wants optionality, especially before the 2026 regulation reset changes the competitive order completely. And this is where the opening claim finally reconnects. Red Bull may have ignored the warning signs because victory disguised the instability underneath. Winning races delayed consequences, but it did not remove pressure. The FIA environment became more politically sensitive, rivals became faster, internal leadership tension continued quietly in the background, technical certainty weakened after Newey uncertainty emerged, and Verstappen increasingly looked like the one person carrying stability while simultaneously questioning it. That is an extremely dangerous position for any Formula One team. Because once the lead driver becomes the center of organizational uncertainty, every future decision starts becoming political. Contract clauses become political, driver market rumors become political, stewarding controversies become political, even strategy mistakes become political. And Formula One history shows that once teams enter that phase, the next transition often arrives much faster than expected. Now the implications become enormous. If Red Bull enters the 2026 regulation era without total internal unity, then every rival team immediately sees opportunity. Mercedes sees opportunity, McLaren sees opportunity, Ferrari sees opportunity. Because the entire competitive balance of Formula One still partially depends on one assumption that Max Verstappen believes Red Bull remains the safest long term place to win championships. If that belief weakens, the entire grid changes with it. And that is why the next several race weekends matter far beyond championship points. Every difficult strategy call, every internal rumor, every frustrated radio message, every performance dip will be analyzed differently now, not as isolated moments, as signals. Signals about whether Red Bull still controls the future of Formula One or whether the sport is quietly entering its next major political realignment. And the most important part is that the story is still unfolding. Because dynasties in Formula One rarely announce their decline publicly, the signs appear gradually: small contradictions, strange timing, growing tension between power centers, until suddenly everybody realizes the shift already started months earlier. If this really is the direction Formula One is heading, then the next phase of the Verstappen story may become bigger than Red Bull itself. And once that possibility enters the paddock, every single decision starts carrying consequences far beyond one championship season.